Labyrinth of the Demon King is a retro-styled dungeon-crawling survival horror game with a feudal Far Eastern aesthetic. You could think of it as a first-person Silent Hill Souls-like, or a Fatal Frame-themed tighty-whitey wedding weebs field, if you will, and I will because there's no one here who can stop me. I enjoyed the game and I think it's worth playing for yourself, so I'll do my best to keep this review spoiler-free, but before I start, I wanted to let you know that I was given an early access key for this game by the publisher. I guess that makes me a big boy game reviewer now, but if you're seeing this video, then the game is already available on PC, PlayStation, and the Nintendo Switch. As of this writing, I don't actually know what the game will cost, so as always, take this information and balance it against what you like about games and your wallet to know if it's for you. I'm not being paid for this, and if the game sucked, I just wouldn't make a video on it at all, but it's important to me that you know that I'm not cashing a fat check to plug whatever someone tells me to. At least not yet, but don't worry, we'll get that NordVPN sponsorship one day. Anyway, like I was saying, despite blending several great tastes that don't necessarily sound like they would taste great together, I was surprised at how well the whole thing worked. I guess it kinda makes sense. Survival horror and dungeon crawling are similar in the ways that they manage player attention. Shortcuts and secret passages are lightly scattered throughout the map, and the puzzles aren't nearly as dense as something like Silent Hill or Post-Trauma, but they still add a nice bit of texture to the gameplay loop. From what I can tell, the game was almost entirely created by a single developer, and the love that they must have for that early era of survival horror permeates every corner of this game. In fact, you might have already noticed some of those corners, specifically these four. The game displays in a forced 4:3 ratio with black bars on the sides, and this definitely took some getting used to. I kept trying to change the video settings thinking I had configured something wrong before it clicked that this was intentional. After the first hour though, I didn't notice it anymore, and in retrospect, it's impressive how much more claustrophobic it made the game feel. I respect the dedication to a vision that it would take to make that decision, as I'm sure that a few players might be turned off by something as simple as the lack of a widescreen view. The menus are similarly retro-themed, deeply reminiscent of a bygone era of game design that could take some getting used to for some, but that felt right at home in my aging millennial heart. And that pixelization filter that most of these older styled indies like to use isn't overbearing, though it did feel more intense when I tested it out on the Steam Deck. On that smaller screen I would see some occasional jagged artifacting. It wasn't egregious, but maybe that filter doesn't scale very well. Aside from that, it ran perfectly fine on the deck, so I guess if you'd like to shit yourself in terror on the toilet, that's probably the best place to do it. It would be hard to say that the game is beautiful as I scramble through dilapidated hallways, barely avoiding the grasping claws of what might have once been humans, but it is an effective and consistent art direction, and it works all the better because unlike most modern horror games, I can actually see what's going on. Even the few friendly NPCs that you'll encounter can be really unsettling, and I always had the sense that if I looked under the mask, they would collapse into a pile of centipedes and cockroaches. It's all supported by some fantastic audio design, both in its music and the ambient noises that play in the background. There are plenty of creaky floorboards, tortured screams, and the heavy breathing of something that runs right down the back of your neck, but of course, when you turn around, there's nothing there. It's deliciously creepy, though it can be a bit off-putting when you speak to an NPC, There's no voice acting in the game, instead it goes for that Okami thing, and I'd probably turn it off if there were an option to, but it doesn't come up very often. There's no time to stand around talking anyway. You've got monsters to kill and puzzles to puzzle over. These stretches of high tension are the majority of the game, but they're broken up by some moments of beautiful scenery and calm atmosphere. It kinda reminds me of Majula. Maybe I don't have to go back out there. I'll just stay here drinking my tea and watching the rain. You know, I don't really like scary games. I've played a lot of them over the years, but I don't particularly enjoy being frightened or the tension that builds up to it. I especially despise jump scares and that Outlast shit where they make the player completely helpless so you have to run around and hide under a bed or in a closet. Thankfully, Labyrinth of the Demon King isn't that kind of horror. There were still plenty of times that I was startled as something attacked me from around a corner or I turned around to a monster that I didn't know was there, but at its core, LDK balances being an action game with a really well-utilized horror aesthetic, and I appreciated that. I don't love that it does have one of those unkillable stalker enemies that chase you around to keep you from getting too comfortable. It's a bias that probably goes back to Prince of Persia 2, but I just don't really like the trope. On the bright side, he's fairly manageable because he doesn't handle verticality well, he'll get distracted by other monsters, he despawns if you leave an area and return, and sprinting doesn't consume stamina anyway. In the worst case scenario, you can also fight him to knock him down for a few seconds and escape, so I guess now's a fine time to talk about the combat. After all, what is every survival horror game remembered for, if not its combat? Alright, that's obviously a joke, just like the combat in most survival horror games. Fighting in Labyrinth of the Demon King is, let's say, rigid. You can't cancel out of your attacks to block or dodge, and there seems to be a bit of a cooldown period, so you're really dedicated to an attack once you start it. Thankfully, you've got a handy little kick to get some breathing room. Stamina management is going to be your main concern, but as you progress, you can increase your stamina or your health at a save point using a ritual incense that can be found in the world. The inspiration is clearly that Kingsfield era of FromSoft games, and that shit was stiff as a board. This game isn't anywhere near that bad, but it does take some getting used to. It's a methodical sort of combat with a fair amount of punishment if you get caught out, but even still, it's rarely a one-hit kill situation, and there are healing consumables scattered around the map or dropped by your enemies. There are no difficulty options, but I still found the combat challenging while never really being starved for healing either. For the most part, weapons have a simple 3-hit combo, a heavy swing that you can charge up, and a counter for after you block an attack. The block doesn't prevent all damage, especially from larger enemies, but in a 1v1 you'll fall into a comfortable rhythm of block and counter that can get you through most fights. For some of the more dangerous encounters, you can often use the environment to your advantage, and I love having the option for something like that, where the inherent limitations of the game's mechanics could lead to frustration rather than a sense of accomplishment. I did encounter some weird things during my playthrough that I would warn you about, but to be totally clear, I can't tell if these are simply design decisions that I don't really understand, or maybe bugs from the fact that I was playing a pre-release build of the game. Like when you go into a safe area, you can't draw your weapons, but when you go back out into a dangerous area, they're still unequipped until you manually re-equip them in your inventory, and you have to do the same for your torch or your lantern every single time you go outside, even if you didn't go to a safe zone. If you do die, you'll revive at the last shrine you visited, but I think this could be an accidental trap for a player that's not paying attention, because when you revive this way, any items that you used are still gone, and enemies respawn when you load into an area, including this revive. So I would just manually load my save again after every death to get those items back. The UI can also be a bit lacking in information, and that's something I expect from a survival horror game, but when I'm picking my loadout for dungeon crawling, I prefer to know a little bit more about what I'm doing. Weapons give a general sense of their stats with these bars at the bottom, but some do status-based damage like bleeding or poison, and I'm not really sure how to compare those things. You can upgrade your equipment at the blacksmith, but the item that you use to do that is limited to find in the world, and expensive to buy. You use the same materials to upgrade weapons and armor, but from what I can tell, upgrading your armor doesn't actually do anything. The armor doesn't give you any information in terms of its defensive stats, so I recorded myself taking the same hit with the base armor and losing about 14 health, and then the second armor set that you find and losing about 12, and then after upgrading the pieces of that second armor set 4 times total, I still took either 11 or 12 damage per hit. And this one especially seems like it might be a bug, but I still didn't really struggle with the enemies too much, so I'd just say conserve your materials for weapons. I did reach out to the publisher to ask about some of these things, and they mentioned possible future updates, but they don't have any solid plans at the moment since they still wanted to gather more player feedback, and I think that's totally fair. Still, nothing I came across was game-breaking, and minor criticisms aside, I had a good time with Labyrinth of the Demon King. My first playthrough took a little under 10 hours, and if anything I've said seems interesting to you, there's a demo available on the game's Steam page. Maybe check it out. Tell them Cal sent you. They won't know who that is. I didn't get paid to make this. And speaking of not getting paid, I'm not trying to get paid by you, but I did make a Patreon. I set up the $1 tier, but I don't really love the idea of putting stuff behind a paywall, so for now at least, anything I put up should be visible to everyone. I figured I could use it as a channel blog for updates and maybe to preview some future projects. There's not much there yet, but if you're already on Patreon, you're welcome to join for free. I'll put a link in the description. As always, thanks for watching. Later.